To be blunt, most players in Rust are terrible at PvP. Even those with thousands of hours, and players who have mastered the AK spray, are terrible at PvP. The biggest issue is that the vast majority of the time you're in Rust, you are not in combat. This creates two sub-issues. The most obvious is that there's very little actual time spent practicing PvP per wipe, but more importantly, you drill in bad habits. There is an old saying, practice makes perfect, but Lombardi said it better when he said perfect practice makes perfect. A natural extrapolation of that is, imperfect practice perfects mistakes. By becoming aware of these mistakes and actively thinking about them, you can become dramatically more effective in combat as little as about 15 minutes. The first and biggest way you're shooting yourself in the foot is, well, trying to shoot yourself in the foot. It's infuriating how much time even veteran players spend looking at their feet, as if they are afraid a rabid gopher is going to come and gnaw on their ankles. To be fair, this isn't just stupidity. First of all, there are no crosshairs in Rust to use as reference, so it's very easy to forget where you're aiming and just kind of drift down. There is also valuable resources on the ground near your feet. Aiming at head level, half of your screen is only showing the sky. And unless you hear a helicopter coming, that means there's nothing really up there to be paying attention to. And by aiming at your feet, the majority of your screen displays the game world and any valuable resources it may contain. Subconsciously, you start to reason. I'll look for resources, and if I see someone, I'll look up. However, this habit becomes ingrained. So even when you know you are in combat, you look down. And then you start every encounter with a panicked flick shot. Now, if you think back to middle school math, you'll remember that a squared plus b squared equals c squared. Or in other words, regardless of where your opponent is and where you're aiming, as long as you're at head level, you will have to move your mouse considerably less distance to line up a shot. This will produce shorter TTKs, or time to kills, and can very well turn a losing fight into a winning fight. Now, for our second point, let's imagine that you always knew where all players on the map were at every given time. Think of how few fights you would actually lose. Every time somebody pops around the corner, if you already knew they were there and had your crosshairs lined on that spot, when they're looking around and trying to find a target, you're already firing at their head. This isn't that unfeasible. Yes, you will never know where everyone is all of the time, but you can reasonably figure out where anyone might be at any given time. The way you do this is by actively thinking. When the pressure's high, I even ask myself out loud, if there was a bad guy where I'm standing now, where would I fight him from? You would be shocked how often you're right. So by pre-lining up shots on spots you think people might be, or where you would be if the bad guy was standing where you are, you'd be shocked how often people just walk into your crosshairs. And you would be shocked how few fights you actually lose because you start firing and landing headshots before they even realize you're there. Now I know everyone listening to this video thinks they're already doing these two things, but the chances are you're probably not. And the only way that you can really tell is by watching your own footage. Thankfully, as long as you're playing on Windows, which most people are, you can simply hit Windows Alt G after every death. This will record the last 30 seconds of gameplay up until the point where you died. The next time you go to play Rust, while you're waiting for the game world to load, go ahead and open up these images and watch through. Most of you will be infuriated watching where you're actually aiming right before you die. If you still struggle with this, hop onto an aim train server and pull up a scoped weapon. You can place a small piece of scotch tape in the center of your monitor, and where the crosshairs overlap, use a light colored Sharpie and put a small dot on your screen. The tape can be removed at any point, and a little Windex will remove the sticky residue. But this will give you a visual reminder of where you're aiming at any given point. If the dot doesn't look like a place where somebody could be, you're aiming in the wrong spot and you should adjust it. My third tip is a lot harder to actually implement, but mastering it can make you absolutely devastating on the battlefield. Whenever you lose sight of another player, make a mental map of the area around them and think of the possible places they could be based on the amount of time that they've been gone. This is considerably more effective when fighting near monuments where you know the terrain a little better. By knowing the routes that they might take and where they would be if they were taking these routes, you can plan your routes accordingly, allowing you to cut them off with good angles with solid cover. It also means you know where they can't be. If they've been gone for 2 seconds and it takes 5 seconds to get over to this piece of cover, you don't have to worry about it. Now let's circle back to actual practice. It is not uncommon for people to practice PvP in Rust, but the way they do this is typically loading onto an aim train server and practicing their AK spray for 1 or 2 hours, and then calling it a day. Now, I am not saying that having better AK spray isn't good. Practice your AK spray, get better with it. The gun is a nightmare to use unless you don't, and once you get it mastered, it can be devastating. But what I am saying is having a perfect AK spray will not help you if you're prim locked. It just won't. The number of bow kids I run into that talk smack when they're down about, well, if I had an AK, I would never lose. I have the world's best AK spray, is kind of hilarious to me because they're running around on the last day of wipe with a bow kit and a wooden base. Even if they're right, and even if they're great with the AK, it didn't help them very much, now did it? Live servers are obviously the most authentic practice you can get, but there's one glaring problem with it. A very small percentage of your time is actually spent in combat, which means the majority of the time you're not actually practicing combat. Gun game is my preferred practice mode for a couple of reasons. First of all, there is very little downtime. This means the vast majority of the time that you're actually playing, you are practicing PvP skills. Secondly, you get to use all of the different weapons in Rust, meaning no matter what happens in your wipe, you have practiced with whatever gun you have available to you. Also, to do well at gun game, you're going to have to get used to making plays on better geared, better armored opponents, using inferior weapons with less armor. There is one major downside to this game mode for practice, however, and that is inherently the weaker weapons you will spend more time practicing with, and the late game weapons that hit harder and do more damage will get less practice time because you will get kills quicker and move past them sooner. Most servers also have AK free-for-all and a rotating weapon free-for-all right next to gun game. These are what I would recommend for learning to use the AK and for learning to use the different weapons of the game. By putting everyone on an even playing field, there is no discrepancy between weapons and gets you a good amount of time practicing each of the different guns. You can also look into Battlefield or 1000 Times servers. These usually spawn you with some late game weaponry and armor and just let you go out and attack people in the closest to a real wipe scenario. The odds are still pretty low because if you lose the encounter, you spawn full metal AK, but it's a lot closer and there's higher risk involved than with, say, gun game or free-for-all.